I want to thank my chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Kerry, with whom I work closely. I want to thank Senator Lugar, the ranking member, who at times has been my chair. It does my heart good to see them working so closely on this. And also, I was very elated to see the vote, the test vote that we had on this already. And I just really hope that that vote that we had, that test vote, is indicative of where we're going. We were almost at 67. My understanding is one member wasn't there to vote. We should be at 67. And I just hope we can get this done at the earliest opportunity, because despite some of the protests of colleagues that say there hasn't been enough time, my understanding is we've been on this for 7 months. 7 months. And no one could have worked harder than our chairman and our ranking member on making sure that every single objection to the New START treaty, every single problem, challenge, understanding was heard, and that a lot of this was already worked out in the resolution of ratification. So hopefully we can get through this. Now, I've had opportunities as a member of Foreign Relations Committee in particular to ask national security experts what keeps them up at night. What's the one thing that they worry about? And whether it comes from the CIA or any other place in the intelligence community, the answer comes back like this. What keeps them up at night is the possibility that a terrorist could get a hold of a nuclear weapon. And I will have to say that worrisome possibility is on the minds of many Americans. Well, the New START treaty makes this less likely. Therefore, it is in our national interest, and frankly, it's in the interest of the world. The New START treaty requires a 30% reduction of deployed strategic weapons on the Russian and American side with boots-on-the-ground verification. And that is key. It reduces delivery systems to 800 per side. And I'm not going to speak very long, I say to my colleagues who have come here, because so much has been said, and I can't say it any better. So what I'm going to do for most of the remainder of my time is quote from people, Republicans and Democrats, who have been quite eloquent, in addition to Senators Kerry and Lugar. It is clear that Democrats and Republicans alike support this treaty, and we hear a lot about no labels and let's come together. Look, this is an area where we have come together, and all we have to do is put the finishing touches on this ratification and complete this very important work that's in front of us. So I'm going to say this. In addition to all of our NATO allies supporting this, including those in Eastern Europe, and I think that is very important to note, we have all of these American leaders on both sides of the aisle. And I will read some of their comments for the record. I urge the United States Senate to ratify the START treaty. This is a statement from a few days ago, President George Herbert Walker Bush. Quote, I fully support this treaty. This is Colin Powell, Secretary of State for George W. Bush. I fully support this treaty. I hope the Senate will give its advice and consent as soon as possible. It's in the best interest of the United States of America, the best interest of the world, and frankly, in the best interest of the Russian Federation. Howard Baker, former senator, Republican from Tennessee, he said just a few days ago, a world without a binding U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control treaty is a more dangerous place, less predictable, less stable than the one we live in today. Trust but verify, he says, ratify this treaty. And then George Shultz, a constituent of mine, Secretary of State for President Reagan, he wrote with Sam Nunn, Democrat, a former senator from Georgia, whom we all respected on these issues, quote, noting the full support of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and following our own review of the treaty, we urge the Senate to give its advice and consent to ratification of New START as early as is feasible. And I just hope we don't have a lot of more delaying tactics around here, because it's not necessary. And I heard colleagues say, what's the rush? What's the rush? What's the rush? We had 7 months. And Senators Kerry and Lugar bent over backwards, did everything possible to accommodate senators like Senator Kyle, who wanted certain assurances on the modernization of our nuclear weapons. They did everything to answer every question. And by the way, they'll continue to do that as we get to any of the reservations. This is what James Schlesinger, Secretary of Defense for Presidents Nixon and Ford, said. I think it's obligatory for the United States to ratify New START. For the United States to fail to ratify the treaty in the due course of the Senate's deliberation would have a detrimental effect on our ability to influence others with regard to particularly the non-proliferation issue. And so James Schlesinger gets to the point of non-proliferation, the worrisome fact that a terrorist or a rogue state could get one of these weapons. Alan Simpson, who we all know, outspoken Republican senator from Wyoming, quote, nothing in the treaty constrains our ability to develop and deploy a robust missile defense system as our military planners see fit. He says the idea that this treaty somehow makes major concessions to the Russians on missile defense is just simply not true. Pat Buchanan, I'm going to quote Pat Buchanan, White House Communications Director for President Ronald Reagan. Richard Nixon, he said, would have supported this treaty. Ronald Reagan, he said, would have supported this treaty as he loathed nuclear weapons and wished to get rid of them, wished to rid the world of them. And simply because this treaty is Obama's treaty does not mean it is not in America's interest. That's Pat Buchanan. I don't think I have ever in my life quoted Pat Buchanan on the floor, just proving the point that this particular issue is extremely bipartisan. It unites everybody except, apparently, a few of our friends on the other side. Brent Scowcroft, Lieutenant General, retired National Security Advisor to Presidents Ford and George H.W. Bush, quote, New START should not be controversial no matter how liberal or conservative you are. And that really makes the point here. Chuck Hagel had a very eloquent statement. He ends it by saying, this would be devastating not just for arms control, but for security interests worldwide if we didn't deal with this issue. Henry Kissinger has a very long statement. I won't read the entire one. But he says, for all these reasons, I recommend ratification of this treaty. I do not believe this treaty is an obstacle to a missile defense program or modernization. Rejection of this treaty would indicate that a new period of American policy has started that would have an unsettling impact on the international environment. So here you have somebody who has been deeply involved in foreign relations for so many years, saying, in essence, and I'm not quoting him here, but I'm summing up what I read, would be a radical departure from America's foreign policy if we were not to do this. James Baker, Secretary of State for President George Bush, and he writes, New START appears to take our country in a direction that can enhance our national security. It can improve Washington's relationship with Moscow regarding nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles, a relationship that will be vital if the two countries are to cooperate in order to stem nuclear proliferation in countries such as Iran and North Korea. And he says, I agree with Secretary of Defense Bob Gates when he wrote last week in the Wall Street Journal that the new treaty provides verification that has been needed since START 1 expired in December. And he says, this is James Baker, an effective verification regime is a critical component of arms control, and I believe the world is safer when the United States and Russia are abiding by one. I ask unanimous consent to place some other statements in the record, and I will close
without objection
with a couple of Democratic individuals who have also joined their Republican friends in this. President Bill Clinton, the START agreement is very important to the future of our national security, and it is not a radical agreement. This is something that is profoundly important. This ought to be way beyond party. He just said that a couple of days ago. William Perry, we remember well, Secretary of Defense for President Clinton. The treaty puts no meaningful limits on our anti-ballistic missile defense program. In fact, it reduces restrictions that existed under the previous START treaty. I recommend ratification. Sam Nunn, delaying ratification of this treaty or defeating it would damage U.S. security interest and U.S. credibility globally. And he takes the same tack that I'm taking, which is he's summing up who supports it. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, former strategic nuclear commanders, and our intelligence community leadership all have stated the treaty is essential to our nation's security. I'm hopeful the Senate will put our nation's security first by providing advice and consent to this important treaty. That's Senator Sam Nunn, Democrat of Georgia, retired. And I'll close with two more quotes, one from Vice President Joe Biden. Failure to pass the New START treaty this year would endanger our national security. We would have no Americans on the ground to inspect Russia's nuclear activities, no verification regime to track Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal, less cooperation between the two nations that account for 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, and no verified nuclear reductions. That's Vice President Biden, and we all know that he was a respected chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. It was my honor to serve with him. And finally, Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, failing to ratify the treaty would not only undermine our strategic stability, the predictability, the transparency, but it would severely impact our potential to lead on the important issue of non-proliferation. So I end where I started. What keeps intelligence community, people, leaders up at night is the fear that we don't wrap our arms around nuclear proliferation, and that a weapon gets into the hands of, a terrorist or rogue nation. And New START, it's not, as our chairman has said many times, it's not a very broad treaty. It's pretty narrow. It's essential, but it doesn't really cover that much new ground. But what it ensures us is we're going to have a mutual reduction in these arms. We're going to be able to verify that, and it makes it less likely that we're going to have the type of proliferation that keeps a lot of us up at night, including the American people, I'm sure. We need to take steps in this holiday season toward peace. We need to take steps every day to make sure that the threat that we face in this difficult world, with all of our challenges, that the threats are diminished. So once again, I want to say to my chairman, and I have to say this to Senator Kerry, with whom I work on so many issues, his leadership on this has been extraordinary. I mean, I was giving up hope that we would be able to get this done, and he constantly said, we don't give up. We just keep on pursuing this. It's the right thing to do, with Senator Lugar by his side. This is a good day. I feel good that we're doing this, and I feel that the people, particularly in this time of the year, will feel much better when we get this done in the bipartisan way. I know we will. Thank you very much, and I would yield the floor.